Today, we're going to continue our discussion about the whole de-dollarization issue and why it's not happening. And today, we're going to focus on why the gold standard is not coming back. And this has to do with BRICS too. Their countries simply cannot afford it, and it makes even less sense for them than it does for the United States. We're going to focus on China, Russia, and India, but a lot of the other countries can fall in the same bucket as India. So let's actually start with Russia first. They're in a war right now, if you don't realize. And the thing is, this is not like a World War II war where there's, America's supplying Uncle Joseph Stalin with tanks and stuff like that. They're kind of by themselves. Ukraine has a lot of allies sending them materials, but the only allies Russia have is basically Iran, North Korea, and maybe China. China actually would rather stay neutral in all of this. They're just not pro-West in this, but they don't actually want to supply Putin with weapons. That's why they're not really overtly supplying them with any big weapons. Iran and North Korea obviously are US enemies, so they're okay to supply Russia with weapons. But they're not supplying Russia for free. They're not getting free donations, kind of like Ukraine is. They're actually Russia's going to have to pay money for those weapons. And money is what it's all about. If you want to pursue aggressive war of expansion like Putin does right now, you have to be able to print money. That means you can't be constrained by something like the gold standard. When the United States dabbled in Afghanistan and Iraq, it costed us trillions of dollars. Where did that money come from? We didn't mine more gold for it. We didn't buy more gold to support it. We just simply printed money. And that's what Russia needs to do. Yes, there's a lot of gold on the market, and they can buy it. But guess what? One, they don't have any money to actually buy the gold. And two, if you the gold standard, you have to set like a set rate between gold and your money. You can't constantly change it. If you constantly change it, then you get inflation, and that whole idea is kind of useless anyways. So the thing is, when you're pursuing a war of aggression, you need to buy materials and you need to buy arms. If there's not the rest of the world supporting you and willing to donate you like free arms or on like kind of a Lend-Lease deal like we did during World War II, and we're not supplying Uncle Vladimir Putin like we supplied Uncle Joseph Stalin back then, they don't really have any big backers for their war, which is why Russia's running really, really short on materials. They basically just held an emergency meeting with North Korea, of all people, for weapons. If you're asking Kim Jong-un for his weapons, which are like Soviet-era weapons, you're probably kind of running low, because you don't ask for Soviet-era weapons unless you're really, really desperate, because those weapons are going to be like 3 generations behind. But the thing is, even with those weapons, Kim Jong-un, as much as he hates the United States, is not going to give you those weapons for free. He is actually going to charge you for those weapons, and to pay for those weapons, you need money. And to get that money, you have to be able to print. The gold standard kind of prevents you from printing. Therefore, Russia right now definitely cannot afford to go on the gold standard. And that's true for any country that's pursuing a war. Ukraine cannot afford the gold standard. America cannot afford the gold standard. In fact, no one can afford the gold standard. So that's the first reason it's not happening. And that is one of the primary reasons for Russia. 2, China cannot afford the gold standard because China's economy is completely based on printing, even more than the United States does. If they actually went on the gold standard, despite how much gold they actually bought, their country would completely tank in terms of economics right now. Remember Evergrande? Yeah, that's not like uncommon in China. All those properties companies are basically going down the drain right now. They're overpriced. It's a huge bubble. The cities like out in the more border regions that are basically empty, that have $1 million condos that these development companies have actually done, those aren't a joke. Those are real. And they're empty because no one wants those condos. So basically, these development companies have saddled themselves with a whole lot of debt. And property prices are on a bubble. Maybe besides the major cities, and even in the major cities, the property prices could actually collapse anytime. And remember, 80% of a Chinese family's wealth is based in the house that they actually own. Unlike here, where the common house may actually take, 5, 6, 7 years of your average salary, a house in China takes 30, 40 years of your average salary. So that's basically their life possession. Generally, the retirement funds aren't that high in China. So 80% of your net worth, if not more, is tied to your house. What happens when the property market tanks over there? Everyone's wealth tanks. no one has any money, and there's a great big revolution because no one has anything anymore and the country is poor. And China is at great risk. Like I said, Evergrande is not like a unique exception. I'm willing to bet that most of the Chinese development companies and land companies are actually like Evergrande, because like there's a lot of houses that no one wants. People want the houses in the cities. That's why they're super expensive. But the houses in the more regions that are trying to develop, no one's moving to those cities. There's cities in Inner Mongolia, cities in the outer provinces that are literally empty. Billions of dollars spent in development. And when no one wants those houses, those companies cannot recoup their money back. And they can't lower the price of those houses. You know why? Because like if they lower the price of their houses, they're taking a serious loss on their development. And if they actually take a serious loss on their development, they're going to go under, which would tank the properties market, which would actually tank the rest of the Chinese people's wealth as well. Now, how does the government prop that up? You guessed it. They print lots and lots of money. And Xi Jinping and the Chinese government absolutely cannot let the retail land market fall in China, because that might actually spark a revolution that could drive them from power. Because if everyone loses their wealth, there's going to be a lot of angry people. And many of those people in the military, they're going to be angry people as well as a lot of the angry people in power. And plus, like, the politicians have a lot of land too. See, the structure how it works in China is like, if you're a government official, you don't actually make a very high salary. Like in the United States, a congressman makes like $177,000 a year, I believe. And that's a decent salary for being a congressman. Yes, you have a lot of costs, but you also get a lot of things paid for. So $177,000 can afford you a pretty nice way of life. In China, the salaries are much lower, and a government official's salary cannot provide for a high quality of life. How do they get that money? Well, one is corruption, but B is like the government gifts certain things like cars, and you guessed it, houses. How do I know? I know people have gotten such gifts. So like they gift cars and houses, and a lot of that value of being a government official is receiving those gifts in China. And the houses are in very nice spots, and the houses are worth a lot of money. But if the property market drops, those houses are not going to be worth a lot of money. So a lot of these politicians that have gotten these properties as gifts essentially don't want the property market to go to crap, because then they're not quite as rich. So they're printing money like crazy to uphold the properties market. And people in China know they're printing like insanity. They're not stupid. They see how much is on the market. The government just doesn't tell you how much they're actually printing, but people can kind of guess, because they can see how much money is actually available out in the market. So because politicians themselves don't want to lose their own wealth, the government definitely doesn't want everyone pissed off at them because they just lost all their wealth when the property markets fall. They're doing everything in their power to prop the property markets up. So there's actually no way that China goes back on the gold standard, because even with all the amount of gold they bought, they just don't have nearly enough to support their printing to prevent the entire system from falling apart. And they're going to try to extend the system for as long as possible. And it's in a much, much worse position than the system in the United States. So that's kind of why China, and plus like China wants to expand their military and expand development as well. So you need both energy and money for those things. And without money, you can't have either one. So China is not going to go back on the gold standard because it does interfere with their development. And going back on the old standard means they can't keep propping the property's value up, which would basically tank the economy into recession, which the CCP is not going to allow. Now let's talk about India. India, of all the BRICS countries, is the only fast-growing one right now. China's growth has petered out. Russia's growth is basically going backwards at this point. India is actually still very fast-growing, and they want to develop like China did in the 90s. But you know what China needed to develop in the 90s, aside from energy? They needed money. That's right. To massively expand your economy, to build the infrastructure, and to invite foreign investment, you need money. And you need internal money from your country to build that infrastructure. And you can't get that without printing. Yes, you can draw in some foreign investment. Of course you can. But not enough. You need money. And how do you do that? You print. That's what everyone does. The thing is, it's really hard in the modern economy right now to actually have a giant industrial expansion, industrial growth, and to lift your people out of poverty without printing. Especially if you have like a natural disaster like India experiences with typhoons and monsoons every once in a while, you need to be able to print money to solve those cases. That does result in inflation in the long run, but at least in the short term, you get to expand like crazy. China spent billions upon trillions of dollars building their city infrastructure, building their railway system across, high-speed railway system across the country, and other things, and to spend a lot on social programs as well. Now, it's easier for China than India because China obviously is an authoritarian type of government. India is more of a democracy. So, like in a democracy, people have to vote and argue on things, whereas China is like whatever the leader says goes. So it's a little bit easier for China to implement those things than India is. But either way, regardless of what kind of government you have, to get those things, you need a lot of money. You're not going to do that on the gold standard, which inhibits you from printing. Because like when you want to start a new project, what is the government going to do? Beg people for money? That rarely ever works. No, they just crank up the printer and print more and more and more money. Now, for countries like Saudi Arabia, they might be able to go back on the gold standard because they have a lot of oil, obviously. So instead of printing money, you just sell that oil for money. But there's also a problem with that too. Remember, OPEC is cutting back production. And although that means that oil prices are going to be high, and that gets them more money, that also means they're selling less. So it kind of balances out. But the oil-rich countries can depend on oil to be their printer, but they're actually producing something, so it might not actually inflate their own money. But a lot of the countries in BRICS aren't oil-producing countries. Look at South Africa and Brazil for a change. The thing is, like, they also really want to develop their economy, especially the Latin American countries like Brazil. Brazil is the biggest economy in Latin America, and they want to build up their infrastructure. Now, some of you nature lovers might not like that because that means leveling a lot of Amazon forest. But the thing is, like, for the country's development, they need to build that infrastructure. But to build that infrastructure, unless you're exporting tons of stuff like oil, you also need to print money to support that because the people building that infrastructure want to get paid, obviously. And obviously, foreign countries need to see that infrastructure before they invest in your country right now. So the thing is, like, countries like Brazil are not going to be going on the gold standard because if they can't print, they can't build that infrastructure necessary for development. And remember, there's a lot of remote Amazon jungle in there that would actually need development to be economically viable in a certain sense. You can't just completely rely on tourism and people looking at toucans to actually make your country profitable. I would like it if they actually did that because I want to preserve that Amazonian environment. I would like to enjoy it someday, go there and fish. But realistically, they are leveling a lot of forest. And to do all that stuff, they actually do need money. There's no way to get around like needing money to do everything right now. And the thing is, like, to get that money, you have to print. There's not enough gold in the world to support all the debt that's going around. The world works on debt financing, and right now there isn't a way out of that. Because if you limit the amount you can print, you limit the amount you can spend, you can have massive economic growth. And remember what BRICS is for? It's to get massive economic growth for developing nations where they can compete with first world nations. And there's really no way they're going to do that without printing a lot aside from the OPEC nations. And that's really just for like places like Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. But for the rest of those countries, they need to print to actually have that economic development. And they're not really going to agree to any kind of gold standard that inhibits their economic growth. That's just not happening. Plus, like I said, the problem with the three major powers of China, Russia, and India not agreeing to the gold standard because it would inhibit their own economic development, prevent them from actually pursuing war, or not let them just artificially prop up their retail land industry. Those things basically doom the gold standard to not happening because it's just not practical for any of the major BRICS nations and not practical for many of the smaller BRICS nations as well. So no matter how many countries end up joining BRICS, they're not going with the gold standard. And BRICS currency isn't happening because India doesn't support it, and Russia and China's economies are teetering on collapse fairly soon because of certain problems that I mentioned in the last video. So that's why the gold standard is happening. Now let's think about this. If the gold standard isn't happening, China, like Russia, no one wants the Russian ruble because it's dropping like a rock. China's economy is in serious trouble. One, because of the retail land thing, and two, because their population issue, which they can't really solve with immigration because no one really wants to move there. So no one really wants their currency in the long run. Plus, you can't trade it on the free market, which kind of disables it from being like a reserve currency. And India is not quite ready to become a reserve currency country, not for the next couple of decades, anyways. What are you going to do to replace the U.S. dollar? I know some of you are going to say like Bitcoin or XRP, that's not happening because those things are way too volatile. So you need actually a country's currency to be the reserve currency. So either you go with the US dollar, which is most likely, you replace it with the euro, which is just as bad, if not worse, or you go with the SDR, which is 60% weighted towards the US dollar anyways. So realistically, it's not happening because there's no alternative. Like China and Russia, their economies aren't doing well, so you don't want to depend on them. India is not ready. The gold standard is just not happening because it's not practical for so many countries who want to expand, pursue wars, prop up their retail industry or whatever. So realistically, those are other reasons why the de-dollarization is just not happening, and the world's going to rely on the US dollar for at least the next 2 to 3 decades. After that, I'm not really sure. But prior to that, it's not happening at all. And the gold standard and the gold bug people, that's also not happening just because the impracticality of it for the BRICS countries themselves. So that's what I have to say for today. Like and subscribe, hit that bell notifications button, and I will see you guys later.